Picked a hell of a time to start making history videos for YouTube. These are confusing times, especially so with regards to politics and history, and the two of them interacting with one another. So I was thinking this would be a good time for us to sit down and have a nice little chat about history, politics, all that sort of thing. So thanks for coming as we try to make sense of at least one small portion of all of this. There's a plague on, people are out in the streets, police are cracking down on peaceful demonstrations, the powers that be are proving themselves to be utterly worthless, etc., etc., etc. However, despite all of the confusion, perhaps even because of it, a lot of people seem to be looking into the mirror and asking themselves that age-old question: which side are you on? What's more, a lot of people seem to be formulating a real answer to that question, and often that answer will involve them, wittingly or not, plopping themselves down on the old left-right political spectrum. What is the left-right political spectrum? What does it mean to be left-wing, right-wing, or a centrist? Where did this seemingly arbitrary designation come from? Is it possible to fall outside of it? And most importantly, what social, historical, and material forces led to that particular way of understanding politics? Well, that means it's time to take a look back at another era of upheaval and use it as a point of reference to give us some clarity. Let's go on a journey of discovery to that magical moment in time where all this left-right bullshit was first accidentally shoved onto us all by a bunch of dandies who decided they really didn't like sitting by people who wanted them dead. That's right, folks. It's time for the French Revolution. Well, now that I've got my Phrygian cap on, we can dive right in. I've actually been wanting to make a video like this for a while now, but due to my never-ending reserves of procrastination fuel, I didn't actually manage to finish my first video until things got cool, which makes it all the more important for people to understand what all this left-right nonsense means. However, before we jump bicorn first into that history, I want to establish some terms, address some common misconceptions, and hopefully get most of us on the same page about what exactly it is that we're talking about. The left-right political spectrum is a tool for understanding where a given thing lands on the question of, should we change society? And in what direction should we go? At the broadest level, a left-wing thing will be something that serves the purpose of moving society in a more egalitarian direction, with an emphasis on changing or dismantling extant hierarchies. A right-wing thing will be something that serves the purpose of preserving the status quo, maintaining current hierarchies, or even reviving an old order. Moderates and centrists will typically be those who find themselves in the middle. No tricks there. Pretty straightforward. What we're mostly looking for are the end goals or the result of what a given thing will be and what the motive is for why that's happening in the first place. Now, I know those definitions are going to rankle some people, especially since it doesn't take a genius to see that there are obvious exceptions one can make that contradict this definition. If you try applying these definitions to specific people, positions, or policies, it can get really confusing really fast. There's a reason why gun control is such a vexing question for so many people. There are arguments for and against gun control all the way up and down the political spectrum. Don't believe me? Consider the following quote from George Washington. "Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the people must be frustrated by force if necessary." Pretty standard for what you'd expect from a pro-gun right-wing position, right? And it's another classic communist ruse. Let's see how this quote plays out in the original German. "Die Waffen und die Munition dürfen unter keinem Verwand aus den Händen gegeben. Jeder Entwaffnungsversuch muss notfalls mit Gewalt verweigert werden." It's a bit different, doesn't it? Even something as simple as placing an American flag behind you can really change the way that people interpret what you're saying. It's bound to make a pretty big difference in how people take the meaning when it's George Washington saying it versus Karl Big Daddy Communism Marx. In that way, it recontextualizes the political meaning of what being pro-gun means, even when the words are nearly identical. With this in mind, it's easier to think of the left-right spectrum as a helpful tool for understanding where a person's starting point for politics is and who they're most likely to be allied with, rather than some concrete fact of reality that can be applied 100% accurately in all situations. For instance, Louis XVI, who was, shall we say, somewhat right of center, attempted some reforms that could be described as left of center. But again, what's important is the why and the where to. Undertaking a left-wing policy with the goal of entrenching or preserving current hierarchies isn't really left-wing, but rather a recuperation of left-wing policies to protect their power and their position in society. People and policies are complex topics that only become more complicated when they collide with society. But understanding why policies and people coalesce into the groups that they do can give us a clearer view of their commonly held stakes and what animates their political actions. In this way, the left-right political spectrum is being used as a lens through which to view things rather than the
indelible political truth inscribed in block font onto the firmament of the universe.
And it becomes a bit easier to reconcile with the reality of our day-to-day nonsense world, becoming a powerful tool for determining where you plop down on that spectrum. We all know where I stand on that issue. I mean, look at me. But by understanding these basic political tensions, why the left and the right exist as they do, you can better process your own political outlook from a different perspective, and hopefully gain some insights into the perspectives of others. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to address some common misconceptions about the left-right divide to get us all, hopefully, on the same page. Hey everybody, welcome to Samuel's Strawman Corner, where I address arguments I'm sure will pop up in the comments, and we get the added bonus of demonstrating that this is all being filmed in a tiny spare room. Number 1. If you're on the right-hand side of the spectrum, you favor individual liberty and small government. If you're on the left-hand side of the spectrum, you favor big government and authoritarianism and collectivism. The far right would be anarchy. The far left would be totalitarianism. Ah, yes, I love seeing anarchism or anarchy just plopped on down on the right-hand side of that there spectrum. Brings a smile to my face as I walk into the ocean, craving the sweet release of death. Regardless, this way of understanding the spectrum only makes sense if larger governments are completely incapable of increasing human freedom, while smaller governments are not. Universal healthcare comes to mind as a good counterexample. In that case, ensuring everyone has healthcare regardless of their ability to pay makes sure people hang on to that vitally important life thing, which, when you think about it, is kind of a necessary prerequisite to the subsequent liberty and pursuit of happiness bits, to borrow a popular phrase. Further, as with many things on the internet, complexity is being compressed to meaninglessness. It is possible, for instance, for people favoring different political ideologies to support the same economic system. If you're trying to make a sweeping claim about how government regulation of mortgage-backed securities is the height of tyranny, then you're going to be missing some nuance that this left-right tool could otherwise provide. 2. I'm as left as they come. I'm old lefty Lefterson, and that's why I think guns should be banned and Michelle Obama should be coronated Queen of America. We've all been there before, haven't we, folks? You're on Twitter talking about how unions are good or whatever, and one of these people pops up talking about how everything to the left of them is fantasy, so saddle up with the real lefties and get to the work of hiring more POC women as cops. Normally, this is a result of people forcing a sort of personal Overton window onto what they consider to be the acceptable bounds of politics, or what is politically possible at any given time. And remember that phrase, because I'm going to keep using it. Regardless, just because a political issue or stance is considered a left-wing issue or a left-wing stance in American political discourse, doesn't mean it's actually being applied in that way. As I brought up before, gun control is actually a pretty good example, which leads us to number 3. Look! I don't make the rules. Gun rights are a right-wing issue. All these lefties are trying to take our guns away. This one is particularly funny because it's just so obviously wrong. Black Panthers up on the State House steps, guerrilla war, John Brown, socialist rifle orgs, none of that. The point here is that any given issue can be framed and used from any place on the political spectrum depending on how it's applied and why it's applied that way. Gun rights can very much be a right-wing issue, but leftists are also keenly aware of what can happen to vulnerable populations in countries where those opposed to them are the only ones with guns. After all, if you live in a society where the police are corrupt and where they're not held accountable to anyone, then who's responsible for the defense of your community? Now that we've got the definitions and common complaints out of the way, let's grab our homemade pikes, take to the streets of history, and see where this all came from by taking a close look at 3 dandy lads. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the dandiest of times, it was actually pretty dandy in both of those cities. On the right, we have His Most Christian Majesty, the King of France, Louis XVI. On the left, we have the Deputy of the National Convention, head of the Montaigne, and prominent Jacobin, Maximilien Robespierre. I am standing in the center in place of the Comte de Mirabeau, because we share a certain vital beauty. As an aside, I was going to try to do a different costume for each of them, but I couldn't afford 3 complete 18th century costumes, and without that, it would basically just be dandified me without glasses, dandified me wearing a coat, and dandified me but with glasses. So here I am, generic 1790s dandy lad. Regardless, let's get right down to it. What the hell was happening in France, and why did a bunch of politicians decide to sit on different sides of the room based more or less on how much they wanted to get rid of the monarchy, which, you'll recall, right-wing, monarchy good, left-wing, monarchy bad. To answer that, we'll want to take a quick look at the most proximate causes of the French Revolution and the factions at play. In the years leading up to 1789, when things got cool, France hadn't exactly been the picture of prosperity and social harmony. The lead up to the revolution itself is extremely complicated, and one of the most discussed questions in, all of history. So we'll just give it a quick and hopefully relatively uncontroversial list of the most important causes. 1. Skyrocketing debt. 2. Bad harvests. 3. Class conflict. 4. Mismanagement and intransigence from above. And 5. A genuine desire for political reform influenced by Enlightenment ideals. A list like this is what we in the history business call a situation rife for the breaking of a few windows. A few Overton windows. Obviously, times of turmoil are fertile ground for shifts in what's considered possible, including events that no one really has any meaningful control over. So looking at this list, it's not hard to see how people of different political persuasions might react to tensions building in society. And react they did. From 1789 to 1791, we saw France was bankrupt. France stopped making debt payments. Meeting of the Estates General is declared. Workers start rioting. Declared meeting of Estates General happens. The Third Estate starts their own cool kids club called the National Assembly and swear a tennis court oath. A crowd raids a prison and liberates some people. The king leaves Paris because it's too cool. A crowd raids a more famous prison to free some people and get some gunpowder. France gets a national guard. Some rights of man and citizen are written. A bunch of angry ladies march to Versailles and bring the king on back to Paris. More riots around France gets a new flag. Louis XVI asks his friends to do something about all this revolution happening. The royal family tries to flee to anywhere else, but only makes it to Varennes. The royal family is brought back from Varennes, accepts the new constitution. France raises a volunteer army. And that's how we got a bunch of people together in a big old room to try and hash this all out. Together, at least, before they decided to sit on opposite sides of the room anyway. At any rate, we'll break those factions down into 3 groups that broadly make up our right, center, and left. The Royalists, the Liberal Reformers, and the Radicals. The Royalists. As one would expect, the Royalists wanted to retain as much power as possible within the prevailing centers of authority, the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church. And using our established definition of the left-right political spectrum, it's pretty obvious why the Royalists fall on the right side of that spectrum. Louis XVI, most of the nobility, and much of the church really wanted to keep those hierarchies intact. After all, you've got the liberal reformers proposing a constitution that could limit the powers of the king, and heaven forbid, you've got those radicals over there proposing crazy shit like universal manhood suffrage, and perhaps even the abolition of the monarchy. Scary stuff. This is where I wanted to find a quote from Louis XVI that would serve as an appropriate summation of his views on this particular question, but it turns out that finding quality English translations of his addresses to the various legislative and political bodies of the French Revolution, or even the manifesto he left behind during the flight to Varennes, are pretty hard to come by, so instead, here's someone else talking about his views from a source I happen to have on hand. From Jean-François Curie in 1804 during a discussion of hereditary government. The noble movements which animated the French people in 1789 were principally directed against feudal institutions, yet we committed the grave error of allowing supreme power to remain in the hands of an essentially feudal family. King of France, Louis XVI never wanted to be king of the French. Born sovereign, he could not truly accept becoming a magistrate. Basically, France served at his behest, not the other way around. And I like this quote because he's making a specific point about what set Louis XVI on the right-hand side of that spectrum, thoroughly placing himself at the top of the status quo with a strong desire to keep power right where it was. When your granddad is famous for saying, "I am the state," like fucking Emperor Palpatine, then it shouldn't be particularly surprising that the personal becomes the political in a very real way for you. The liberal reformers. Now, I don't want to shock anyone, but the liberal reformers weren't the far-left radicals that they've become in today's dumbest of all possible worlds. Rather, the people in the center of the political spectrum were considered, brace yourselves, centrists or moderates. Periodic reminder that all of this is relative to where the Overton window is situated in a given society. Just like any other grouping on the political spectrum, they're more diverse than they're given credit for, but their unifying trait can be boiled down to, well, we want change, but let's be sensible about this. For Americans, the most famous of these people is probably the Marquis de Lafayette, seen here looking just beautiful in his banner of the Maid artwork. But I want to go to the Comte de Mirabeau to actually capture the essence of what drove the liberal reformers and the constitutional monarchists. It was in order to assure yourselves the more strongly that even in the pursuit of excellence, you would confine yourselves within bounds. In a word, it was in order to display a moderation, which is particularly the commitment of courage, or rather without which there is no courage truly durable and invincible. The whole speech is essentially a reminder that everyone assembled has legitimate grievances, but 1, the king, he's aware, and boy is he doing stuff about it. And 2, let's not get too crazy here. Wouldn't want us slipping into antique prejudices, the Gothic oppressions of ages sunk in barbarism. What can I say? Dude really knew how to spice up his run-on sentences. Just as a quick historical aside, after Mirabeau's death and the fall of the monarchy, letters were discovered in the Tuileries Palace that indicated Mirabeau had been working with the monarchy throughout the revolution. This is something we see throughout history and to the present day. People don't always want their political inclinations to be known. And a good way to camouflage those beliefs is to appeal to a seemingly sensible middle ground. Just something to keep in mind. The radicals, our venerable left in the form of the Girondins, the Montaigne, the Jacobins, and the Sans-Culottes, with some significant overlap between them. As the French Revolution progressed in the years following 1789, the Overton window kept shifting further and further to the left, and it's not too hard to see what drove them. The left position was defined by a desire for a full revolution and a real, substantive reordering of society. They wanted everything that the right feared, and wanted more than the moderates and reformers thought was possible. The dandy lad himself, Maximilien Robespierre, put it well when addressing those in favor of a more moderate tact. Citizens, did you want a revolution without a revolution? What is this spirit of persecution that has come to revise, so to speak, the one that broke our chains? But what sure judgment can one make of the effects that can follow these great commotions? Who can mark, after the event, the exact point at which the waves of popular insurrection should break? At that price, what people could have ever shaken off the yoke of despotism? You can't remake society without pushing the boundaries of that very society. If asking nicely got anyone anything from the powers that be, they would quickly find themselves the powers that were. With these 3 examples, it's easier to see the fundamental divides, the underlying tensions of French society that separated them from one another and made their demands and aims irreconcilable. The right wants to maintain the status quo, the left wants to overturn it, and the center wants everyone to meet in the middle and hash it out. But no one was budging. What happens when political factions find themselves at loggerheads? When the class contradictions within society cannot be resolved, and no one political orientation can really hold on to the reins of power? Well, there are a couple ways that can all get sorted out, one of which is bloody civil war a la the Vendée, but there's another option that functions well to illustrate what the essence of the left-right political spectrum really is, and it does this by kind of smashing the whole thing and duct taping it back together. So let's take a cue from Daddy Marx and get a bit dialectical and do what we always do on this channel. That's right, we're talking about Napoleon again. And here we go again, folks. He's back in the saddle of history, upon the horse of time, wielding the sword of, I don't know, archaeology? Whatever. Let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. But first, I know you're probably asking yourself a question. Is every single third section of each of my videos going to be about Napoleon? I don't know. Is Edelgard von Hresfeld clearly a stand-in for a weird fusion of Marxism and Napoleon? Am I way too deep into Fire Emblem Three Houses to not do a video on it? I leave that to you, dear viewer, to decide for yourself. What were we talking about again? Left-right political spectrum. Yes. Okay, see, Napoleon isn't perfect for our discussion because he's some sort of outstanding example of a right-wing or left-wing figure, or because he's a run-of-the-mill moderate trying to thread the needle between those two, at least not in the traditional sense. Rather, Napoleon represents the syncretic political synthesis of a historical dialectic. So what the hell does that mean? First, syncretic politics. Syncretism refers to the melding or fusing of different traditions, religions, really any social or historical practices into a new whole. Think of the way that pagan practices and traditions influenced the rise of early Christianity in Europe, many of which are still present to this day. Therefore, syncretic politics are a fusing of different political tendencies into a new whole that is distinct from previous factions or tendencies. The third wayism of Clinton and Blair is a good example, where the ostensibly left-leaning parties essentially stole the right-wing platform. Forgive the source, but I honestly think Wikipedia has the most succinct definition. The third way is a political philosophy and political position akin to centrism that attempts to reconcile right-wing and left-wing politics by advocating a varying synthesis of center-right and centrist economic platforms with some center-left social policies. It's important to point out that this is different from a more traditional moderate or centrist, where the goal is to bridge the gap between competing sides through cooperation and compromise. A third-way approach typically rejects that those sides should exist in the first place and proposes itself as an alternative by taking ownership of positions from all over the spectrum. It's not hard to see how this applies to Napoleon. He was the Jacobin who became an emperor. He was the destroyer of feudal ties who attempted to recolonize Haiti and subjugate her people, who had fought and died to throw off the shackles of slavery. He codified laws that made no distinction based on one's birth, but attempted to entrench a new aristocracy with him at its helm. It's those contradictions that lead us to the second half of the story. What's all this about a historical dialectic? To understand that, we'll need to talk about what's called dialectical materialism and different ways to think about history. First, what's that word material doing here? It's actually about as literal as can be. We live in a material world and are material beings with material wants and needs. Far from vague ideals or philosophical principles being the main mover of history, Marx and Engels understood that history is driven by the mundane. From Marx: Zum Leben aber gehört vor allem Essen und Trinken, Wohnung, Kleidung und noch einiges andere. Die erste geschlechtliche Tat ist also die Erzeugung der Mittel zur Befriedigung dieser Bedürfnisse. Die Produktion des materiellen Lebens selbst. Und zwar ist dies eine geschlechtliche Tat, eine Grundbedingung aller Geschichte, die noch heute, wie vor Jahrtausenden täglich und stündlich erfolgt werden muss, die Menschen ihr Abenleben zu erhalten. The goal, then, is to focus on our world as we find it, to move away from the philosophical realm of ideals, and instead engage with the material world as we find it, centering the human condition. Second, what's that word dialectic doing? I think the easiest way to understand it, that accounts for most of the ways you'll encounter it in the real world, is that everything is full of various tensions, and these tensions can exist both in the material world and exist between ideas. For example, one could describe the tension between the left and the right as a dialectic contradiction within society that needs to be resolved. Further, understanding and breaking down these tensions is an extremely powerful tool for understanding, well, just about everything. It's an approach to inquiry that helps give us a more complete picture of the world and the forces that move it, including helping us understand why seemingly contradictory things can come together to form a new whole. Hopefully you see where I'm going with all of this. Napoleon doesn't so much represent a moderate or centrist, but rather a fusion of the left and right wings of society, bonded together into something new. You'll have to forgive the reference, but Matt Christman of Chapo fame actually put it quite succinctly on the Age of Napoleon podcast.
He was a guy who brought both sides together, but I think specifically what he did is the two principles that he reaffirmed that were central to the project of the reactionary right and the Jacobin left were hierarchy on the right, which they had seen as being the reason that things had been so chaotic was the lack of a king, right? I mean, they wanted a king back, and Napoleon, by embodying the nation in himself, gave them a figure who could reaffirm a hierarchy along the lines that they sought. But he did it on the terms of meritocracy. And I think meritocracy is really like the guiding principle of the bourgeois revolutionary movement that the left in France represented.
Napoleon managed to resolve that contradiction within French society by creating something new, to the point where the left-right spectrum broke down, ushering in a new political paradigm, and offering us another insight into how those tensions within society interact with one another. So, what's the point of all of this? I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, all you've done here today is explain the historical roots of one type of political spectrum. That doesn't make it any better than Stephen Crowder's Liberty Scale.
The idea that Hitler was right-wing, no. He was a very, very emphatic liberal, big government socialist. Undeniable.
My point here isn't to dunk on dweebs like Crowder, or to show you 1,500 political spectrums that are all wrong for various reasons. Rather, the point is that those terms, left and right, are inescapable in the hell world we find ourselves occupying at present. And it's important to know what people mean when they're invoked. Further, if you yourself aren't really sure what these terms, left and right, really mean, then it makes it that much easier for bad actors to disingenuously distort the meaning of those terms to suit their ends. There's a reason why people post spectrums such as this, or obfuscate the issue by saying reductive shit like, actually, right-wing equals small government and left-wing equals big government. Understanding the history of the term makes it clear exactly how they're wrong, and tools like historical materialism make it easier to understand what they're trying to do. And that's step one in figuring out what exactly to do about all of this. After all, it's not enough to just describe the world. The point is to change it. So while it's true that I'm very solidly on the left and have some, let's say, moral disagreements with the right, I believe that holding a light to these ideas can be, well, illuminating for all involved. It can help foster a healthier dialogue between sides, but it can also help you draw a line and ask that ever-important question. Which side are you on? Well, vive la révolution, les amis.